You don't belong in this cabin, let alone on this aircraft. And if you don't move to the back right now, I'll have security drag you off this plane myself." The words hung in the air like poison as Captain Daniel Reed loomed over the woman in seat 1. His voice dripping with the kind of authority that had crushed spirits for decades. He had no idea he was staring into the eyes of the person who owned not just the seat, not just the plane, but the entire airline he worked for. And in the next 10 minutes, his life was about to change forever. The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the pristine Elite Airways terminal at JFK Airport, creating rivers that raced down the glass like tears on a giant's face. Inside, the air smelled of expensive leather and fresh orchids, the kind of sanctuary that money could buy and arrogance could protect. This wasn't just a waiting area for the wealthy. It was a fortress where the world's most powerful people could hide from the chaos of commercial travel. Zara Chen pushed through the heavy glass doors, shaking droplets from her oversized Georgetown University hoodie that had seen better days about 3 years ago. At 32, she had the kind of face that photographers called striking, but today it was hidden behind thick-rimmed glasses that had cost $12 at a campus bookstore. Her faded black jeans had a hole near the left knee, and her backpack looked like it had survived a war zone, which, in a way, it had. The war zone of building a company from her dorm room to a $5.2 billion acquisition by the time most people were still figuring out their career paths. She walked up to the marble reception desk, dragging a carry-on bag that wheezed slightly from a broken wheel. The woman behind the counter, whose nameplate read Madison and whose makeup looked like it had been applied with architectural precision, didn't even glance up from her computer screen initially. When she finally did lift her eyes, her nose wrinkled slightly, a microscopic gesture that spoke volumes about her assumptions. Madison's gaze traveled from Zara's worn sneakers to the fraying hem of her hoodie, lingering on each imperfection like a quality control inspector finding defects on a luxury product. The silence stretched between them, heavy with judgment and expectation, until Madison finally spoke with the kind of icy politeness that came standard with positions of perceived power. "Excuse me, miss, this is the private terminal for pristine elite members only," Madison said, her tone suggesting Zara had wandered in by accident. "Deliveries and service personnel need to use the entrance around back near the hangars. There should be signs directing you to the proper area." Zara didn't blink, didn't flinch, didn't show even the slightest surprise. She had learned in the 3 years since selling Logiflow to Amazon and becoming one of the youngest self-made billionaires in tech that money changed everything about how the world worked, except one crucial detail: people's immediate assumptions about who deserved respect and who didn't. She preferred it this way, actually. It made it incredibly easy to see who people really were when they thought no one important was watching. "I'm not making a delivery," Zara said softly, sliding a black titanium card across the marble surface with a sound like a sword being drawn. "I'm checking in for flight PE447 to London. Zara Chen." Madison stared at the card as if it might spontaneously combust in her perfectly manicured hands. It was the pristine Elite Obsidian status card, a piece of metal so exclusive that only 8 existed in the entire world. It didn't just signify membership. It represented equity-level investment in the airline itself, the kind of financial commitment that most countries couldn't afford to make. She picked up the card with trembling fingers and typed Zara's name into her computer system, with the desperate speed of someone who had just realized they might have made a career-ending mistake. The screen flashed bright green, and words appeared that made Madison's face drain of color faster than someone had pulled a plug. Priority owner class. Executive authority level. Ms. Chen Madison stammered, her entire demeanor shifting from gatekeeper to terrified servant in the space of a heartbeat. "I sincerely apologize for the confusion. The system didn't indicate. We weren't expecting someone of your status to appear so comfortable. It's a long flight. Zara replied with the kind of dry humor that came from watching people tie themselves in knots over their own prejudices. Is seat 1A available? I specifically requested the bulkhead for privacy and workspace. Madison's fingers flew across her keyboard with renewed desperation, pulling up seating charts and passenger manifests like her life depended on it. Yes, absolutely. Seat 1A is reserved for you. I should mention that the flight is nearly at capacity today. We have several high-profile guests traveling to the Global Economic Summit in London, including some government officials and Fortune 500 executives. Perfect, Zara said, taking her boarding pass and slipping it into her hoodie pocket next to a smartphone that contained enough financial power to buy small countries. Just get me on board. I have work to do before we land. As Zara walked toward the security screening area, leaving behind a receptionist who looked like she needed immediate medical attention, she pulled out her phone to check the final details of tomorrow's acquisition meeting. She was purchasing Voltaic Motors, a struggling European electric vehicle startup, whose innovative battery technology could revolutionize clean transportation. She had been awake for 36 hours straight coding a critical security patch for their navigation algorithms, and all she wanted was 6 hours of uninterrupted peace to finish the work and maybe catch some sleep. What she was about to get instead was a reminder of exactly why she had learned to hide her wealth in the first place, and why the most expensive lesson in respect was about to be taught to a man who thought he owned the sky. Captain Daniel Reed sat in the airline's crew briefing room, staring at the flight manifest on his tablet while nursing his third cup of coffee that morning. At 48, he had the kind of weathered face that spoke of 2 decades spent in cockpits, but the lines around his eyes weren't just from squinting at horizons. They were the accumulated stress marks of a man whose life had slowly spiraled from respect and purpose into desperation and compromise. 5 years ago, Daniel Reed had been the kind of pilot that passengers felt safe with and crew members looked up to. He had treated everyone from celebrities to economy passengers with the same professional courtesy, believing that dignity was something you gave freely rather than something people had to earn. But that was before the divorce, before the alimony payments that consumed 60% of his salary, before his teenage daughter stopped talking to him because he couldn't afford the college tuition he had promised, and before his ex-wife's lawyer had made it crystal clear that missing payments meant losing what little time he had left with his children. The pressure had changed him in ways he didn't like to examine too closely. Each entitled passenger who had threatened his job over minor inconveniences, each airline executive who had reminded him that pilots were replaceable each month when his bank account ran dry before his bills were paid, had slowly chipped away at the man he used to be. The respect he once gave freely had become a commodity he rationed, saving it for people who could affect his career trajectory or make his financial problems disappear. Now staring at today's passenger list, he felt that familiar knot in his stomach that came with decisions he knew were wrong but felt powerless to avoid. The flight to London was supposed to be routine, a straightforward 7-hour journey with 30 of the world's wealthiest and most influential people. But 10 minutes ago, his phone had buzzed with a text that changed everything. The message was from Rebecca Martinez Pristine, Elite's Director of VIP Relations, and it was the kind of communication that could make or break a pilot's career. Congressman Blake Morrison needs emergency accommodation on PE 447. His private jet had mechanical failure. Morrison is personal friend of CEO Henderson, must have seat 1A for motion sickness. Handle this discreetly and professionally. Your cooperation noted for upcoming promotion reviews. Daniel stared at the message until the words blurred together. Congressman Morrison wasn't just any politician. He was the chair of the House Transportation Committee, the man who controlled aviation regulations and airline subsidies. More importantly, he was Blake Morrison Daniels' old college roommate, who had gone from fraternity president to political powerhouse while Daniel had spent 20 years flying other people to their important meetings. The problem was seat 1A. According to his manifest, it was occupied by someone named Zara Chen, a name he didn't recognize but assumed was probably another tech entrepreneur or hedge fund manager's daughter. The kind of person who could afford an Obsidian membership but didn't have the real power to destroy careers or approve promotions. Jessica Walsh, his lead flight attendant, knocked on the briefing room door and entered with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been managing airline politics longer than she cared to remember. At 35, she had seen enough passenger drama to fill several books, but she had never lost her commitment to treating everyone fairly, regardless of their appearance or perceived importance. Captain Reed, Jessica said, settling into the chair across from him with a concerned expression. I wanted to discuss the passenger situation before boarding begins. I noticed there's a note in the system about possible seat reassignments for VIP accommodation. Daniel looked up from his tablet, already feeling defensive about a conversation that hadn't even begun yet. It's just a minor adjustment, Jessica. We have a congressman boarding who needs specific seating for medical reasons. Motion sickness issues that require the bulkhead position. Jessica frowned, her years of experience immediately recognizing the warning signs of a situation that could go very wrong very quickly. Captain, the passenger in 1A, checked in hours ago and specifically requested that seat for workspace requirements. She has Obsidian status, which means she's not just a regular member. Those cards are only issued to major investors. Look, Daniel said, his voice taking on the edge that had become more common lately when he felt backed into a corner. I understand your concern about passenger rights, but sometimes we have to make accommodations for people whose needs take priority. Morrison isn't just any passenger. He's someone who can make or break this airline's federal contracts. Jessica leaned forward, her expression becoming more serious as she recognized the direction this conversation was heading. Daniel, I've been doing this job for 15 years, and I've never seen a situation improve when we start bumping paying passengers for unofficial VIP treatment. It always ends badly, especially when we're making assumptions about who deserves what level of service. But Daniel's mind was already made up, driven by a desperation that made ethical considerations feel like luxuries he couldn't afford. His daughter's college acceptance letter was sitting on his kitchen table, and the deposit deadline was approaching faster than his next paycheck. His ex-wife had made it clear that failing to secure his promotion would mean renegotiating their custody arrangement, which was lawyer speak for losing access to the only thing in his life that still mattered. Sometimes you have to make tough decisions, he said, closing his tablet with finality. The passenger in 1A will be fine in a different seat. She probably won't even care once we explain the situation politely. And if she does complain, we'll upgrade her on the next flight and give her some travel vouchers. Jessica stood up slowly, recognizing the futility of arguing with a man who had already convinced himself that compromise was the same thing as necessity. I hope you're right, Captain. But in my experience, treating people like they're disposable based on assumptions about their importance usually reveals more about us than it does about them. As she left the briefing room, Daniel tried to push down the growing certainty that he was about to cross a line he had been approaching for months. He told himself that it was just one seat, just one passenger, just one small compromise in a career full of larger sacrifices. He had no way of knowing that in 30 minutes, he would discover exactly how expensive it could be to confuse desperation with judgment, and to mistake someone's humility for powerlessness. Zara settled into seat 1A with the relief of someone who had finally found sanctuary after a long day of being underestimated. The pristine elite cabin was a masterpiece of luxury design, with 30 individual suites that were more like private hotel rooms than airplane seats. Each suite had a sliding door for complete privacy, a lie-flat bed, and a workspace large enough for serious productivity. The lighting was soft and warm, designed to reduce the harsh reality of being 7 miles above the earth in a metal tube traveling at nearly the speed of sound. She pulled out her laptop and connected to the aircraft's high-speed internet, immediately diving into the code that would secure tomorrow's acquisition of voltaic motors. The algorithm she was debugging was critical to the startup's navigation firmware, the kind of technical work that had made her fortune and continued to drive her passion long after money had ceased to be a motivating factor. She put on her noise-canceling headphones and lost herself in the meditative rhythm of problem-solving, unaware that her peaceful flight was about to become anything but peaceful. 20 minutes into her coding session, she felt a sharp tap on her shoulder that made her jump slightly. She pulled off her headphones and looked up to see a man in a pilot's uniform standing in her doorway with an expression that was trying very hard to look apologetic but was failing to hide an underlying impatience. Captain Daniel Reed had spent the walk from the cockpit to seat 1A rehearsing what he would say, crafting words that would sound reasonable and professional while accomplishing what he needed to accomplish. But seeing Zara in her oversized hoodie and faded jeans looking more like a college student than a business executive, his carefully prepared speech shifted into something that felt more like a conversation with someone who wouldn't understand the complexities of airline operations. "Ms. Chen, isn't it?" Daniel asked, glancing at the tablet in his hand as if he were confirming information rather than delivering a predetermined verdict. "I'm Captain Reed. I need to discuss a slight operational adjustment we need to make with today's seating arrangements." Zara looked at him with the kind of focused attention she gave to complex problems that required careful analysis before responding. "What kind of operational adjustment?" "Well, we've had a last-minute situation develop with a priority passenger who has specific medical requirements." Daniel explained, his voice taking on the practiced tone of someone who is used to making unreasonable requests sound perfectly reasonable. "I'm going to need to relocate you to seat 6B, which is actually a lovely window position toward the middle of the cabin. You'll have more privacy there, and the view is quite spectacular on this route." Zara set down her laptop and gave Daniel her full attention, immediately sensing that this conversation was about something other than operational necessities or medical requirements. "I specifically booked seat 1A because I need the workspace and the privacy for important business that I need to complete during this flight. I paid for this specific seat, and I arranged my entire schedule around having these particular accommodations." Daniel felt his practiced patience beginning to fray as he encountered unexpected resistance from someone he had assumed would be easily managed. "I understand your preference, Ms. Chen, but we're dealing with federal regulatory requirements here. We have a government official boarding who requires the security protocols that come with the bulkhead position. It's not really a request, it's a compliance issue. It was a complete fabrication, and Zara knew it immediately. Her company had worked extensively with the FAA on aviation software contracts, and she was intimately familiar with federal transportation regulations. There was no federal requirement for government officials to sit in any particular seat, no security protocol that mandated bulkhead positioning, and no compliance issue that would justify bumping a confirmed passenger." Captain Reed Zara said, her voice remaining calm, but taking on a subtle edge that suggested she was not as easily manipulated as he had assumed. "I'm quite familiar with aviation regulations, and I know for certain that what you're describing isn't actually a federal requirement. I reserved this seat, I paid for this seat, and I'm not moving." The direct challenge to his authority hit Daniel like a physical blow, awakening the defensive anger that had been growing stronger with each month of financial pressure and professional humiliation. He wasn't used to being contradicted by passengers, especially young passengers who looked like they were flying on someone else's money. The careful facade of professional courtesy began to crack, revealing the desperation and resentment underneath. "Listen to me carefully," Daniel said, leaning closer and lowering his voice to the kind of tone that had intimidated subordinates and silenced complaints for years. "I don't know who paid for your ticket, whether it was your parents or your boyfriend or some company you work for, but on this aircraft, my word is final. We have Congressman Blake Morrison boarding in 5 minutes, and he's a man of considerable importance who requires specific accommodations." Zara stared at him with an expression that was becoming increasingly dangerous, though Daniel was too focused on his own authority to recognize the warning signs. The assumption that someone else had paid for her ticket, the dismissive tone about her appearance. The implication that her needs were less important than those of a man of considerable importance all combined to create exactly the kind of situation that revealed the ugly truth about how the world really worked. "You're making a mistake," Captain Zara said, her voice dropping to the quiet register that people who really understood power used when they were about to demonstrate it. "A very expensive mistake. Is that supposed to be some kind of threat?" Daniel laughed, straightening up and raising his voice enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for this delay, but we have a passenger who seems to think that airline regulations don't apply to her." Just then, the cabin door opened with a hydraulic hiss, and Congressman Blake Morrison entered like a man accustomed to having rooms rearrange themselves around his presence. He was loud, boisterous, and carried himself with the kind of self-importance that came from decades of having other people solve his problems for him. Two aides followed behind him, both looking like former college football players who had found careers in making their boss feel more important than he actually was. Danny Boy Morrison boomed, spotting Daniel and grinning with the fake warmth of a politician who never forgot a useful connection. "Good to see you again. I hope you've got my usual spot ready. My back is absolutely killing me, and you know I can't handle anything but the bulkhead position." Daniel forced a smile that looked more like a grimace, gesturing toward seat 1A where Zara remained seated with her laptop balanced on her knees. "Just finishing up a minor adjustment, Blake. We'll have you settled in just one moment." Morrison looked at Zara for the first time, his eyes traveling over her casual clothes and unimpressed expression, with the kind of dismissive assessment that powerful men used when they encountered people they didn't consider worth their attention. Well, what do we have here? Looks like someone's daughter got lost on her way to coach class. The comment hit the cabin like a slap, and Zara felt something inside her chest tighten with the familiar pain of being reduced to an assumption of having her worth measured by other people's expectations rather than her actual accomplishments. But this time was different. This time she didn't have to smile politely and accept the disrespect. This time she had the power to show these men exactly what their assumptions were worth. Zara closed her laptop with deliberate slowness and reached into her hoodie pocket for her phone. She didn't call a lawyer or a travel agent or her parents. She dialed a number with a Swiss country code and waited for the voice that answered to confirm that the most powerful lesson these men would ever receive was about to begin. "Hello, this is Director Mueller." The voice that answered Zara's call carried the crisp efficiency of Swiss precision mixed with the kind of authority that moved mountains and rearranged airline schedules with a single conversation. Zara looked directly at Captain Reed as she spoke, her voice carrying across the cabin with crystal clarity so that every passenger could hear exactly what was happening. "Hans, this is Zara Chen. I need you to authorize an immediate ownership override protocol on Flight P E447. Yes, right now, while we're sitting at the gate." Daniel felt a cold finger of uncertainty trace down his spine as he heard words that sounded suspiciously like administrative codes, but he was too committed to his course of action to back down now. He rolled his eyes and gestured dismissively at Zara's phone call playing to Morrison and the watching passengers like a performer who had practiced his act too many times. "Who are you calling your daddy?" Daniel mocked, his voice dripping with condescension. "Or maybe your travel agent." "I hate to break it to you, sweetheart, but it's too late for whatever connections you think you have. Congressman Morrison needs this seat, and you're moving whether you like it or not." Zara ignored him completely, continuing her conversation with the kind of calm authority that people who actually controlled billions of dollars used when they were rearranging the world to their specifications. Authorization code Zulu X-ray 7 owner. Password Nemesis. I need immediate notification sent to the flight crew that they are currently attempting to remove the principal stakeholder from her assigned seat. Morrison was getting visibly impatient, checking his expensive watch and sighing loudly like a man whose time was far too valuable to waste on whatever drama was playing out in front of him. For God's sake, Danny, just get security up here and drag her off. I have a dinner meeting in London that I cannot miss, and I'm not going to let some entitled college girl ruin my schedule. But Daniel was beginning to feel the first stirrings of genuine concern as Zara's phone conversation continued. The words she was using, authorization codes, ownership, override, principal stakeholder, sounded less like someone making desperate phone calls to family members and more like someone who understood the technical language of corporate hierarchy. He pulled out his own tablet and glanced at the screen where a red notification was beginning to flash in the corner. Jessica Walsh had been watching the entire confrontation from the galley with growing horror, recognizing all the warning signs of a situation that was about to explode in spectacular fashion. She had tried to catch Daniel's attention several times, but he was too focused on his performance of authority to notice her increasingly frantic signals. Now she approached the group with her professional smile firmly in place, hoping to de-escalate before someone did something that couldn't be undone. Captain Reed Jessica said carefully, "Perhaps we could discuss alternative solutions that would accommodate both passengers' needs. Ms. Chen has been very reasonable, and I'm sure we can find a way to resolve this without creating any unnecessary conflict." The only resolution here, Daniel snapped his frustration finally boiling over, is for this passenger to follow crew instructions and move to the seat she's been assigned. We don't negotiate with people who think their personal preferences override federal regulations and airline policy. Zara finished her phone call and slipped the device back into her pocket, then looked at Daniel with an expression that was somehow both patient and predatory. Captain Reed, I strongly suggest you check your flight management tablet. I believe you have a new message from headquarters that might clarify some things for you. Daniel glanced down at his tablet, where the red notification was now flashing more urgently. His finger hovered over the alert, and something in Zara's tone made his stomach clench with the first real fear he had felt since this confrontation began. The message header read, "Urgent fleet-wide alert. Asset ownership transfer protocol activated." What the hell is an asset ownership transfer? Morrison demanded, reading over Daniel's shoulder with the entitlement of someone who had never been told that other people's business was none of his concern. Danny, what's going on here? I thought you had this under control. Before Daniel could respond, his tablet chimed with an incoming call from the airline's operations center. The caller ID showed Rebecca Martinez, the director of VIP relations who had sent him the original message about accommodating Morrison. Her voice when he answered was tight with barely controlled panic. "Captain Reed, please tell me you have not attempted to remove the passenger in seat 1A, Rebecca said without any preliminary pleasantries. Please tell me that you received the fleet alert and understood its implications before taking any action." What fleet alert? Daniel asked, though even as the words left his mouth, he was beginning to understand that he had missed something crucial. Something that was about to change everything about his understanding of the situation he had created. "The passenger you are trying to remove from seat 1. A is Zara Chen," Rebecca said, and Daniel could hear papers rustling frantically in the background as if she were reading from files that had been pulled in emergency sessions. She is the founder and CEO of Pinnacle Aviation Holdings, which completed the acquisition of pristine Elite Airways approximately 6 hours ago. She doesn't just own Seat 1 of Captain Reed, she owns the entire aircraft you're standing on. The words hit Daniel like a physical blow, and he felt the blood drain from his face so quickly that he had to grip the seat back to keep from swaying. Morrison, who had been listening to the conversation with growing confusion, suddenly went very quiet as the implications began to register. Around them, passengers who had been filming the confrontation with their phones began to murmur among themselves as they realized they were witnessing something far more significant than a simple disagreement over seating arrangements. Zara stood up slowly, smoothing down her hoodie and adjusting her glasses with movements that were somehow both casual and commanding. She looked at Daniel with an expression that contained no anger, no triumph, just the quiet certainty of someone who had been vastly underestimated and was about to demonstrate exactly how expensive that miscalculation had been. "Captain Reed," she said softly, "when I said you were making a mistake, I wasn't making a threat. I was giving you an opportunity to reconsider your assumptions about who deserves respect and who doesn't. But since you've chosen to proceed with removing me from my own aircraft, I think it's time we discussed the consequences of treating people like they're disposable based on their appearance." The silence that followed Zara's words was so complete that the only sounds in the cabin were the gentle hum of the aircraft's electrical systems and the distant rumble of ground equipment outside. Daniel stared at his tablet screen, reading and rereading the ownership transfer notification, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something that made sense in the world he thought he understood. Morrison's face had gone from its usual ruddy confidence to an ashen gray that made him look like a man who had just realized he was standing on a trapdoor that was about to open beneath his feet. His two aides were backing away slowly, the political instincts that had kept them employed telling them to distance themselves from their boss before the cameras started rolling. "There has to be some mistake," Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. The passenger manifest didn't indicate any special status. "Ms. Chen, if you're really who you claim to be, why didn't you identify yourself when I approached you about the seating change?" Zara looked at him with something that might have been pity if it weren't mixed with such profound disappointment. "Captain Reed, I shouldn't have to prove my worth or identify my net worth to receive basic courtesy and respect. I bought a ticket, I checked in for my assigned seat, and I was treated like garbage because you made assumptions about my value based on my clothing and my age." Jessica, who had been standing frozen during the phone call revelation, now stepped forward with the look of someone who had seen enough workplace disasters to recognize when immediate damage control was necessary. "Ms. Chen, on behalf of the entire crew, I want to apologize for this completely unacceptable situation. This is not how Pristine Elite treats any passenger, regardless of their status." Actually, Zara said, her voice taking on the edge that came with years of fighting battles in boardrooms full of men who looked exactly like Daniel and Morrison. "This is exactly how airlines treat passengers when they think those passengers don't have the power to fight back. The only difference today is that your assumptions were spectacularly wrong." More passengers had begun to gather around the edges of the confrontation, their phones recording everything as the story unfolded. A woman in Seat 2 F-Tech entrepreneur Linda Zhao was live-streaming the entire incident to her 500,000 followers, with commentary about implicit bias in the service industry. A man in 3A had already posted the video to his LinkedIn with the caption, "What happens when you judge a book by its cover?" Daniel's phone rang, and this time it was a number he recognized with dread. His direct supervisor, Chief of Flight Operations Patricia Coleman, a woman whose reputation for swift and decisive action in crisis situations was legendary throughout the airline industry. Reed Patricia's voice cut through the speaker like a scalpel. "Please tell me that the reports I'm getting from the gate agents are some kind of miscommunication. Please tell me that you did not just attempt to forcibly remove Zara Chen from her seat." "I was following instructions about VIP accommodation," Daniel said weakly, the fight draining out of him as he began to comprehend the magnitude of his error. "I received a message about Congressman Morrison needing priority seating for medical reasons." Daniel Patricia said, and her use of his first name carried the weight of finality that came before career-ending pronouncements. "Zara Chen didn't just buy our airline. She bought our parent company, our maintenance contracts, our fuel suppliers, and our catering services. She essentially owns every aspect of your employment from your paycheck to your pension, and you just tried to kick her off her own airplane." Morrison, who had been frantically whispering with his aides, suddenly straightened up and attempted to deploy the political charm that had carried him through 2 decades of damage control. "Ms. Chen, I believe there's been a terrible misunderstanding here. I had no idea about your ownership status, and I certainly never intended any disrespect. If I had known who you were, this entire situation would have been handled completely differently." Zara turned to look at Morrison with an expression that could have frozen jet fuel. "Congressman Morrison, that statement tells me everything I need to know about your character. You're not sorry about the disrespect. You're sorry that you showed disrespect to someone with the power to make your life difficult. The problem isn't that you didn't know who I was. The problem is that you treated me badly because you thought I was powerless to do anything about it." The truth of her words hit the cabin like a physical force, and several passengers actually winced as they recognized themselves in Morrison's mindset. How many times had they dismissed service workers, ignored people they deemed unimportant, or made assumptions about someone's worth based on their appearance or perceived status? Hans Muller, the Swiss director whom Zara had called, appeared at the aircraft door with the efficiency of someone who had rearranged his entire schedule to personally handle a crisis. He was a tall, distinguished man whose presence immediately commanded attention, and he surveyed the scene with the expression of someone assessing damage after a natural disaster, Mrs. Chen Han said, approaching with the kind of respect that acknowledged not just wealth, but the intelligence and vision that had created that wealth. "I came as soon as I received your call. How would you like us to proceed with this situation?" Zara looked around the cabin at the assembled passengers, crew members, and airline officials, who were all waiting to see what kind of justice someone with unlimited financial power would choose to dispense. She could destroy Daniel's career with a phone call, ruin Morrison's political future with a single social media post, and create such a public relations nightmare for the airline industry that it would take years to recover. But as she stood there in her faded jeans and Georgetown hoodie, surrounded by people who had finally learned to see her clearly, she realized that revenge wasn't what she wanted. What she wanted was transformation. The kind of change that would prevent other people from experiencing what she had just gone through, the kind of shift in thinking that could only come from education rather than punishment. "Hans," she said finally, "I want to offer Captain Reed and Congressman Morrison a choice. They can face the full consequences of their actions: termination, public humiliation, and legal action for discrimination and harassment. Or they can participate in a comprehensive bias training program and help us create new policies to ensure this never happens to anyone else." Daniel looked at her with genuine surprise, having expected immediate termination and public destruction. Morrison seemed equally shocked that he was being offered an alternative to political suicide. Around the cabin, passengers were recording what was possibly the most powerful lesson in leadership and mercy they had ever witnessed. "The choice," Zara continued, "will reveal who you really are when faced with consequences for your actions. Are you the kind of people who learn and grow from your mistakes, or are you the kind who only care about avoiding punishment?" Daniel Reed stood in the cabin of the aircraft he had flown for 5 years, surrounded by passengers whose respect he had lost, facing the woman whose dignity he had trampled, and he felt the weight of every decision that had led him to this moment. The financial pressures, the professional compromises, the gradual erosion of his moral compass. All of it had culminated in this confrontation where his character was being measured not by his years of experience or his technical skills, but by how he treated someone he thought couldn't fight back. "Miss Chen," Daniel said, his voice barely steady, "I need you to understand that I never intended any personal disrespect. I was following what I believed were operational requirements, and I made assumptions based on incomplete information." "No," Zara interrupted, her voice cutting through his attempted justification with surgical precision. "You made assumptions based on my appearance, my age, and your belief that I didn't have enough power to matter. You treated me exactly the way you wanted to treat me, Captain Reed. The only thing you didn't account for was the consequences. Jessica stepped forward, having watched enough of her captain's behavior over the past months to recognize that this confrontation was about far more than one incident. Ms. Chen, I want you to know that several crew members have witnessed Captain Reed's pattern of differential treatment toward passengers. This isn't the first time he's made assumptions about people's worth based on their appearance or perceived status. The admission hit Daniel like a physical blow, the realization that his crew had been watching his gradual transformation into someone he wouldn't have recognized 5 years ago. Morrison, meanwhile, was frantically calculating the political damage of being associated with a viral video of discrimination, his mind racing through possible spin strategies and damage control measures. I think there's been enough blame assigned here, Morrison said, attempting to take control of the narrative with the practiced ease of someone who had survived multiple scandals. The important thing is that we resolve this situation professionally and move forward constructively. I'm sure Ms. Chen understands that mistakes happen in high-pressure environments. Zara looked at Morrison with an expression that could have melted steel. Congressman Morrison, I want to be very clear about something. This wasn't a mistake. This was a choice. Captain Reed chose to prioritize your comfort over my rights because he believed you had more power than I did. You chose to support that decision because you felt entitled to special treatment. Neither of you made an error in judgment. You both revealed exactly who you are when you think no one important is watching. Hans Mueller, who had been observing the exchange with the analytical precision of someone who managed billion-dollar assets, stepped forward with documents that had been prepared during his flight to New York. Ms. Chen, we have the termination paperwork ready for Captain Reed, and our legal department has prepared cease and desist orders for Congressman Morrison regarding his use of airline services. We can have both of them removed from the aircraft and banned from all Pinnacle Aviation properties within the hour. The cabin fell completely silent as everyone processed the magnitude of the consequences being discussed. Daniel's career would be over, his ability to support his children, destroyed his professional reputation, demolished so thoroughly that he would never fly commercially again. Morrison's political standing would be eviscerated by the viral video. His credibility on transportation issues eliminated, his relationship with airline lobbyists permanently severed. But Zara raised her hand, stopping Hans before he could proceed with the paperwork. Before we implement those consequences, I want to offer both men an alternative that will reveal whether they're capable of genuine change or only interested in avoiding punishment. She walked to the center of the cabin, addressing not just Daniel and Morrison, but all the passengers who were recording what had become an impromptu masterclass in leadership and justice. I'm going to give you both a choice that will define the rest of your careers and your lives. You can accept immediate termination and public disgrace, or you can participate in a comprehensive program designed to help you understand and address the biases that created this situation. Daniel looked at her with desperate hope, sensing that he was being offered something he didn't deserve, but desperately needed. What kind of program? 6 months of intensive bias training with diversity education specialists, Zara explained. You'll work with people who have experienced discrimination, learn about the impact of unconscious bias, and help develop new policies to prevent incidents like this from happening to other passengers. Captain Reed, you'll train other pilots on respectful customer service. Congressman Morrison, you'll sponsor legislation requiring bias training for all transportation industry workers. Morrison's political instincts immediately began calculating the advantages of being associated with progressive legislation rather than viral discrimination videos. And if we complete this program successfully, then you'll have demonstrated that you're capable of growth and change, Zara said. Captain Reed keeps his job, but undergoes regular review. Congressman Morrison avoids public disgrace, but commits to meaningful policy reform. Both of you become part of the solution instead of remaining part of the problem. But she continued, her voice hardening. If you refuse this opportunity or fail to complete the program with genuine commitment, the consequences will be swift and permanent. Captain Reed will be terminated and banned from commercial aviation. Congressman Morrison will face a federal discrimination lawsuit and public release of all video evidence. Jessica, who had been listening to the exchange with growing admiration for Zara's approach, stepped forward to add her own perspective. Ms. Chen, I want to support whatever decision you make, but I also want you to know that Captain Reed wasn't always like this. The financial pressure and job insecurity changed him over the past year. If he's willing to do the work, I believe he can remember who he used to be. Daniel felt tears welling in his eyes as he realized that his lead flight attendant, despite witnessing his worst behavior, was still advocating for his potential for redemption. Ms. Chen, I accept your offer completely and without reservation. I want to understand how I became someone who could treat another human being the way I treated you today. Morrison, recognizing that his political survival depended on appearing reformed rather than merely punished, nodded his agreement. I also accept your terms, Ms. Chen. Perhaps this experience will help me become a more effective advocate for civil rights in transportation. Zara studied both men carefully, looking for signs of genuine remorse versus calculated self-preservation. In Daniel's eyes, she saw shame, regret, and a desperate desire to make amends. In Morrison's expression, she saw political calculation, but also a dawning awareness that his worldview needed serious adjustment. Very well, she said finally. Hans, please prepare the appropriate documentation. Captain Reed will complete his bias training while remaining employed under probationary status. Congressman Morrison will begin working with our legal team to draft comprehensive anti-discrimination legislation for the transportation industry. As the tension in the cabin finally began to dissipate, passengers started putting away their phones and returning to their seats. Several approached Zara to express their admiration for how she had handled the situation, while others thanked her for giving them a new perspective on their own unconscious biases. Daniel stood quietly for a moment, processing the magnitude of what had just transpired, then approached Zara with the humility of someone who had just learned the most expensive lesson of his life. Mrs. Chen, I know that words can't undo the disrespect I showed you, but I want you to know that I will spend every day of the next 6 months proving that your faith in my ability to change wasn't misplaced. Zara looked at him with an expression that contained both skepticism and hope. Captain Reed, the program you're entering isn't about proving anything to me. It's about discovering who you want to be when you think no one powerful is watching, because that's when your true character reveals itself. As Flight PE 447 finally pushed back from the gate and began its taxi toward the runway, the atmosphere in the cabin had transformed completely from the tension and conflict of an hour earlier. Captain Reed's first officer, Michael Torres, had been promoted to acting captain for the flight, bringing a completely different energy to the cockpit communications. His voice over the intercom carried warmth and professionalism as he announced their departure. And for the first time in months, the crew seemed to be working as a unified team rather than walking on eggshells around their captain's volatile moods. Zara had returned to her work in Seat 1A, but found herself unable to concentrate on the Voltaic Motors acquisition code as conversations erupted around her. The incident had awakened something in the other passengers, a collective examination of their own assumptions and biases that was both uncomfortable and necessary. Linda Zhao, the tech entrepreneur who had been live streaming, approached Zara's seat during the initial climb. Miss Chen, I wanted to thank you for handling that situation with such grace, Linda said, settling into the empty seat across from Zara with permission. Watching you offer education instead of punishment made me realize how many times I've written people off based on superficial judgments. It's made me question some of my own hiring practices and business relationships. The conversation that followed drew other passengers into an impromptu discussion about unconscious bias that would have been impossible before the confrontation. A pharmaceutical executive admitted to making assumptions about employees based on their educational backgrounds. A hedge fund manager talked about how he had dismissed potential investments from founders who didn't fit his preconceived notions of successful entrepreneurs. A federal judge shared her efforts to examine her own courtroom decisions for patterns of bias. Daniel Reed spent the flight in the crew rest area, but instead of hiding in shame, he found himself engaging with flight attendants about their experiences with passenger discrimination. Jessica shared stories of customers who had demanded different servers based on her accent, passengers who had questioned her competence because of her age, and the countless microaggressions that had accumulated over her 15-year career. The thing that surprised me most, Jessica told Daniel during one of their conversations, was how the passengers who witnessed everything started questioning their own behavior. I've never seen anything like it. Usually people just want to pretend these incidents didn't happen, but Ms. Chen's response created space for everyone to learn something. Morrison had found himself unexpectedly engaged in conversation with a civil rights attorney who happened to be on the flight discussing the legislative possibilities for comprehensive bias training across transportation industries. His initial political calculations were gradually being replaced by genuine interest in the policy implications of what had occurred. The federal government requires safety training for every aspect of aviation operations, Morrison found himself saying. But we've never mandated respect and dignity training with the same rigor. Ms. Chen's approach could become a model for industry-wide reform. As the aircraft leveled off at cruising altitude, Zara finally closed her laptop and accepted an invitation to join a larger conversation that had formed in the cabin's common area. Passengers who had started the flight as strangers united only by wealth were now connected by a shared experience that had challenged all of their assumptions about power, respect, and human dignity. What struck me most, said Robert Kim, a venture capitalist from Silicon Valley, was realizing how many times I've probably made someone feel invisible or unimportant without even knowing it. Ms. Chen, your decision to offer education instead of punishment showed a level of leadership that I've rarely seen in boardrooms or anywhere else. Zara found herself sharing stories from her own journey, talking about the foster care system that had shaped her understanding of powerlessness, the academic challenges she had overcome, and the business obstacles she had faced as a young Asian woman in the tech industry. Her vulnerability encouraged others to share their own experiences with discrimination, privilege, and the moments that had shaped their perspectives on fairness and justice. The most powerful thing about what happened today, Zara reflected, wasn't that I had the authority to change Captain Reed's behavior. It was that everyone on this flight chose to examine their own assumptions and commit to treating people better in the future. That's the kind of change that actually transforms industries and communities. By the time they were halfway across the Atlantic, the cabin had become an unlikely classroom where some of the world's most influential people were learning lessons about empathy, respect, and the responsibility that comes with power. Several passengers had already begun making commitments to implement bias training in their own companies, support legislation for anti-discrimination measures, and use their platforms to advocate for more inclusive practices. The transformation wasn't limited to grand gestures and policy changes. Passengers were also making personal commitments to notice and interrupt their own biased thinking, to listen more carefully to people whose experiences differed from their own, and to use their privilege and influence to create opportunities for people who had been historically excluded from spaces of power. The descent into London Heathrow occurred under overcast skies that seemed to mirror the gravity of what had transpired during the flight. Word of the incident had spread far beyond the aircraft itself, with social media videos and news reports creating a global conversation about discrimination power and the responsibility of institutions to protect the dignity of all customers regardless of their appearance or perceived status. As the aircraft touched down with a gentle thud of wheels on tarmac, passengers could see through the windows that media trucks and reporters had gathered at the private terminal. The story had evolved beyond a simple airline incident into a broader discussion about implicit bias, corporate responsibility, and the way society treats people based on assumptions about their worth and status. Captain Torres had handled his first international flight as acting captain with skill and professionalism that impressed even the most experienced travelers. His calm competence stood in stark contrast to the chaos that had preceded takeoff, and several passengers made a point of thanking him for his excellent service during the flight. Zara had already submitted paperwork promoting him to full captain status, recognizing that leadership emerged not just from technical skills, but from character under pressure. Daniel Reed stood at the aircraft door as passengers deplaned, offering personal apologies to each person who had witnessed his behavior. The responses he received ranged from acceptance to skepticism, but most passengers acknowledged his apparent sincerity and expressed hope that his commitment to change was genuine, rather than simply strategic. The real test, Linda Zhao told Daniel as she passed, will be how you treat passengers 6 months from now when you think no one is recording and no one important is watching. That's when we'll know if this transformation is real. Morrison faced his own reckoning as he prepared to leave the aircraft. His staff had been monitoring social media and news coverage throughout the flight, and the political implications of the incident were becoming clearer with each passing hour. Editorial boards were already calling for his resignation from the Transportation Committee, and hashtags demanding his accountability were trending across multiple platforms. Congressman Morrison Zara said as he gathered his belongings, "Your political career will ultimately be defined not by what happened today, but by what you do with the opportunity I've given you. Use it wisely." The media attention that greeted their arrival at Heathrow was intense but respectful, with reporters focusing on the unprecedented nature of Zara's response to discrimination rather than sensationalizing the conflict itself. In a brief statement to the press, Zara emphasized that her goal was not to punish individuals, but to create change that would prevent other people from experiencing similar treatment. Today's incident revealed something that happens every day in the service industry, Zara told the assembled reporters. The difference is that I had the power to demand accountability and create consequences. My hope is that this situation will inspire broader changes that protect all customers, not just those with the resources to fight back. Jessica Walsh found herself unexpectedly thrust into the spotlight as news outlets sought to understand the crew's perspective on the incident. Her thoughtful commentary about the importance of treating all passengers with dignity regardless of their appearance or perceived status resonated with service industry workers around the world who had witnessed similar incidents but lacked the authority to intervene. Mrs. Chen could have destroyed careers and ruined lives, Jessica told BBC News. Instead, she chose to create an opportunity for learning and growth. That's the kind of leadership that actually changes corporate culture instead of just generating headlines. The ripple effects of the incident extended far beyond pristine elite airways within hours of their landing. Airlines across Europe and North America began reviewing their customer service policies, implementing new training programs, and creating reporting mechanisms for passengers who experienced discrimination. Industry associations called emergency meetings to discuss comprehensive bias training requirements, and passenger advocacy groups began organizing campaigns for binding anti-discrimination standards. Zara completed her business meeting with Voltaic Motors executives in record time, finalizing the acquisition that would revolutionize clean transportation technology while simultaneously fielding calls from corporate leaders who wanted to understand how to implement similar dignity protocols in their own organizations. The business deal that had seemed so important 12 hours earlier now felt secondary to the conversation about respect and equity that her response had initiated. The personal transformations that had begun during the flight continued to evolve as passengers returned to their regular lives. Robert Kim announced that his venture capital firm would require bias training for all investment partners and would actively seek to fund startups led by underrepresented founders. Linda Zhao committed to reviewing her company's hiring and promotion practices with external equity consultants. The pharmaceutical executive pledged to examine clinical trial enrollment for demographic bias. The conference room at the National Transportation Institute was packed beyond capacity as Daniel Reed approached the podium to deliver his presentation on unconscious bias in aviation customer service. The man who stood before the audience of pilots, flight attendants, and airline executives bore little resemblance to the captain who had confronted Zara Chen 6 months earlier. His demeanor carried the humility of someone who had examined his own failures honestly and emerged with a deeper understanding of human dignity and professional responsibility. 6 months ago, I nearly destroyed my career and traumatized a passenger because I made assumptions about her worth based on her appearance. Daniel began, his voice steady but filled with the weight of genuine remorse. Today, I want to share what I've learned about how unconscious bias affects every interaction we have with passengers and how we can create a culture of respect that serves everyone equally. The transformation in Daniel's perspective had been profound and genuine. The intensive bias training program had forced him to confront not just his behavior toward Zara, but patterns of differential treatment that had developed over years of financial pressure and professional frustration. Working with discrimination education specialists, he had learned to recognize the triggers that led him to make snap judgments about people's importance or value. More importantly, he had spent time with passengers who had experienced discrimination on flights, hearing their stories and understanding the lasting impact of moments when they had been made to feel unwelcome or unworthy. These conversations had awakened an empathy that had been dormant during the most difficult period of his career, helping him remember why he had originally chosen aviation as a profession. Jessica Walsh, now serving as Pristine Elite's Director of Passenger Experience, had worked closely with Daniel to develop training protocols that were being adopted across the industry. Their partnership had evolved from supervisor and subordinate to colleagues united by a shared commitment to ensuring that every passenger felt valued and respected, regardless of their background or appearance. The program Daniel completed isn't just about avoiding discrimination, Jessica explained to the conference audience. It's about actively creating inclusive environments where everyone feels welcome. We've seen measurable improvements in customer satisfaction, crew morale, and overall service quality since implementing these protocols fleet-wide. Congressman Morrison had fulfilled his commitment to sponsoring comprehensive anti-discrimination legislation for the transportation industry, though his political motivation had gradually evolved into genuine conviction about the importance of civil rights protections. The bill known as the Passenger Dignity Act required bias training for all customer-facing transportation workers and established federal oversight mechanisms for discrimination complaints. What began as a moment of personal failure became an opportunity to create policy that protects millions of travelers, Morrison reflected during a committee hearing on the legislation. Ms. Chen's response taught me that true leadership means taking responsibility for our mistakes and using them to create positive change for others. The legislation had passed with bipartisan support, largely because Morrison's personal experience with unconscious bias had created authenticity in his advocacy that resonated with colleagues across the political spectrum. Airlines, train companies, bus services, and ride-sharing platforms were now required to implement comprehensive dignity training programs and report discrimination incidents to federal oversight agencies. Captain Michael Torres had embraced his promotion with the kind of leadership that inspired both crew members and passengers. Under his command, Pristine Elite had achieved the highest customer satisfaction ratings in the industry, with particular praise for the respectful treatment of all passengers regardless of their appearance or perceived status. His success had led to speaking engagements at aviation conferences around the world, where he shared best practices for inclusive customer service. The culture change we've experienced goes far beyond policy compliance, Torres told an audience of airline CEOs. When crew members feel empowered to treat every passenger with dignity, it creates a positive environment that benefits everyone on the aircraft. Our employees are more engaged, Our customers are more satisfied and our business results have improved across every metric that matters. Zara Chen had used her platform and resources to establish the Dignity and Service Foundation, which provided bias training and policy development support to service industries beyond transportation. The foundation had worked with hotels, restaurants, retail chains, and healthcare organizations to implement comprehensive respect protocols that protected customers from discrimination while creating more positive work environments for employees. The foundation's work had attracted attention from civil rights organizations, business leaders, and policymakers who recognized that Zara's approach offered a scalable model for addressing bias across multiple industries. Rather than focusing solely on punishment for discriminatory behavior, the foundation emphasized education, accountability, and cultural transformation that prevented incidents from occurring in the first place. Real change happens when we move beyond individual consequences to address the conditions that allow discrimination to flourish. Zara explained during a Harvard Business School case study presentation about her response to the airline incident. The goal isn't to destroy people who make mistakes. It's to create environments where those mistakes become increasingly rare. The personal relationships that had formed during the flight had continued to evolve over the 6 months following the incident. Passengers stayed in touch through a private network that had become a community of practice for inclusive leadership, sharing experiences and strategies for using their influence to create more equitable outcomes in their respective industries. Linda Zhao had implemented bias training across her entire technology company and had established mentorship programs for underrepresented entrepreneurs. Robert Kim's venture capital firm had invested in more startups led by women and people of color in 6 months than in the previous 3 years combined. The pharmaceutical executive had restructured clinical trials to ensure more diverse participation, leading to better health outcomes for previously underserved populations. 1 year after the incident that had changed so many lives, Zara Chen stood in the same pristine elite terminal at JFK where her journey had begun, but this time she wasn't alone. Daniel Reed was beside her, along with Jessica Walsh, Captain Torres, and a diverse group of aviation professionals who had gathered for the annual Dignity and Service Conference that had grown from a small industry meeting into an international movement. The terminal itself had been transformed not just physically, but culturally. The staff training that had begun as an emergency response to Zara's experience had evolved into a comprehensive program that was now considered the gold standard for customer service in luxury travel. Every employee from ground crew to executives had participated in bias education that helped them recognize and interrupt discriminatory thinking before it affected their interactions with passengers. A year ago, I walked through these doors expecting to be judged by my appearance, and I was, Zara reflected during her keynote address to the conference attendees. But what happened next taught all of us that the most powerful response to discrimination isn't revenge or punishment. It's education that transforms hearts and minds, creating change that prevents other people from experiencing the same pain. Daniel had become one of the most sought-after speakers on unconscious bias in the aviation industry, his personal transformation serving as proof that people could change when given the opportunity and support to examine their own prejudices. His presentations were powerful not because he had found easy answers, but because he spoke honestly about the ongoing work of recognizing and challenging his own assumptions about other people. The hardest part of this journey wasn't admitting that I had discriminated against Ms. Chen, Daniel told the conference audience. It was recognizing all the times I had made other people feel invisible or unworthy without even realizing it. The bias training didn't just change how I treat passengers, it changed how I see my responsibility to create dignity for everyone I encounter. His relationship with Zara had evolved from adversarial to collaborative, built on mutual respect and shared commitment to preventing other people from experiencing discrimination. They had worked together on policy development training programs and advocacy initiatives that were transforming not just the airline industry, but service sectors across multiple countries. Jessica Walsh had leveraged her promotion to create passenger advocacy programs that empowered crew members to intervene when they witnessed discriminatory treatment, while also providing support systems for customers who experienced bias during their travel. Her work had been recognized by civil rights organizations and had inspired similar initiatives in industries beyond transportation. The culture change we've achieved proves that individual actions can create ripple effects that transform entire organizations, Jessica explained during a panel discussion about implementing dignity protocols. When leaders demonstrate that every person's worth is non-negotiable, it gives everyone permission to treat each other with the respect that should be universal. Captain Torres had used his position to mentor young pilots and flight attendants, emphasizing that technical skills were only part of aviation excellence. His leadership philosophy, which prioritized inclusive service and passenger dignity alongside safety and operational efficiency, had influenced training programs at airlines around the world. Congressman Morrison, despite initial political motivations, had become a genuine advocate for civil rights in transportation, sponsoring additional legislation that protected workers from discrimination and created pathways for underrepresented individuals to enter aviation careers. His committee work had established federal funding for bias education programs and oversight mechanisms that ensured accountability across the industry. The Passenger Dignity Act had been expanded and strengthened based on the success of its initial implementation, with requirements extending to international carriers operating in United States airspace. The legislation had become a model for similar laws in Europe and Asia, creating global standards for respectful customer treatment that were reshaping the travel experience worldwide. As the conference concluded, Zara found herself reflecting on the unexpected journey that had begun with a simple desire for a quiet flight to complete a business acquisition. The Voltaic Motors deal had been successful, contributing to revolutionary advances in clean transportation technology, but it had been overshadowed by the more important work of creating dignity and respect across multiple industries. "When I chose to offer education instead of punishment," Zara said during her closing remarks, "I wasn't being generous or forgiving. I was being strategic. Destroying individual careers would have generated headlines for a few days, but changing hearts and minds creates transformation that lasts for generations." The personal growth that had occurred among the original passengers had continued to expand, creating networks of inclusive leadership that were influencing corporate cultures, policy decisions, and social norms far beyond the aviation industry. Their shared experience had become a catalyst for examining privilege, confronting bias, and using power responsibly to create opportunities for people who had been historically excluded. Daniel approached Zara as the conference ended, carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had found purpose through adversity. "Ms. Chen, I know I can never fully make up for the disrespect I showed you, but I want you to know that this work has given my life meaning in a way that flying planes never did. Thank you for seeing potential for change instead of just seeing someone who deserved punishment." Zara smiled, recognizing in Daniel's transformation the proof that her approach had been correct. "Captain Reed, the person who treated me badly that day isn't who you really are. He was who you became under pressure when you forgot your own values. The man standing here today is who you choose to be when you remember that every interaction is an opportunity to affirm someone's humanity." As they prepared to leave the terminal, Jessica joined them with an update that captured the full scope of what their shared experience had achieved. The latest industry reports show a 67% reduction in discrimination complaints across airlines that have implemented our training protocols. More importantly, customer satisfaction scores indicate that passengers feel more welcome and respected regardless of their background or appearance. The numbers represented more than statistical improvements. They represented millions of travelers who would experience dignity instead of discrimination, respect instead of assumptions, and welcome instead of judgment. The change that had begun with one woman's refusal to accept disrespectful treatment had expanded into a movement that was transforming how entire industries understood their responsibility to serve all customers with equal dignity. The most powerful lesson from this experience, Zara concluded as they walked together through the terminal that had once been the site of her humiliation, is that true change doesn't require perfect people or flawless systems. It requires individuals who are willing to acknowledge their mistakes, learn from them, and commit to treating others better in the future. Daniel, Jessica, and Captain Torres nodded in agreement, each carrying forward the understanding that dignity costs nothing but its absence costs everything. Their transformation from a moment of discrimination into a movement for equity had proven that the most important victories aren't won through punishment or revenge, but through the harder work of changing hearts, opening minds, and creating cultures where every person's worth is recognized and protected. Today, Pristine Elite Airways leads the global aviation industry in inclusive service standards with the Dignity Protocol, inspired by Zara's experience, ensuring every passenger receives equal respect regardless of appearance or perceived status. Captain Torres now directs the program internationally. Jessica trains crew members across 6 continents, and Daniel's bias education workshops have reached over 50,000 aviation professionals worldwide. The airline's customer satisfaction ratings have reached historic highs, proving that respect and profitability strengthen each other. Zara continues expanding her technology empire while funding education programs that have awarded over 2,000 scholarships to underprivileged students pursuing careers in transportation and technology. She still travels in hoodies and worn jeans, but now airline staff worldwide recognize her as an inspiration rather than an anomaly. The Dignity in Service Foundation has partnered with organizations across 12 countries, creating workplace cultures where discrimination has become increasingly rare through education rather than punishment. The viral video from that transformative Tuesday morning continues circulating with one enduring message: never judge someone's worth by their appearance. True character reveals itself through how we treat others when we believe no one important is watching. Sometimes the most important person in the room is the one everyone overlooks. And that's exactly how lasting change begins. Not with grand gestures, but with the quiet choice to see dignity in every human being we encounter.